Good afternoon, good evening, good day, all that good stuff. Thank you for joining me. Welcome to my channel, Hollywood Decoded. I am a marvelous, and thank you for your attention because that's something that you can't ever get back. So, this channel is dedicated towards covering the symbols and some of the hidden meanings behind some of the TV shows and movies that's out there in Hollywood. Because a lot of what we see is more than just what we see. There's a lot of stuff behind what we see. So actually covering the symbols and the various meanings within these movies and these TV shows can give us a lot of insight to reality and things that are actually real outside of Hollywood. With that, this video is going to cover a TV show called Charmed. It was on the WB network, aka CW, and I believe it was either the highest or second highest rated show that debuted at the time on that network. So that's telling because that shows the growing interest in the subject matter of what that show covered, which was Wicca and witchcraft. It's also no coincidence that that show came out in 1998, and the 1990s was a significant pivotal point for Wicca and witchcraft. That is when it basically increased to a large popularity. From 1990 to 2001, some 10 million books were sold, I believe, on the subject, and it became the fastest growing religion in the country, right? And it became the third most practiced after Christianity and Islam, but it was rising faster than Christianity and Islam. And they say that Wicca members doubled every 30 months in terms of people that actually admitted and subscribed to it. So the 90s was the point, well, the 60s first, that kicked it off, and I'll cover that in other videos. But the 90s was when it became popular and mainstream. The 60s was when it was first introduced by the government and power structures and implemented upon the masses. The 90s is when it started to be adopted by the masses as a whole to something that went from taboo and ridicule to something that was enjoyed and practiced on a large scale. Became perfect for mass consumption. And you could tell that by the amount of shows that came out during the 1990s that covered the subject. There was Charmed, which came out in 98, Harry Potter, which came out in the 90s, a movie called Practical Magic with Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman that came out in 98, I believe, as well. A movie called The Craft, which came out in 97, and a host of others. So 1990 was a pivotal point for witchcraft, and that is definitely, I believe, a reason as to why not only were these shows and movies successful, but why they came out during the 90s as opposed to the 80s or the 70s, because that is the time period that it became acceptable for you to start practicing these things on a social level where you wasn't outcast or ridiculed. There's still some taboo, some eye raising, but now it's okay because, you know, it's acceptable to some degree. So this show, right, the first episode is about three sisters that realize that they have these abilities, these powers, so to speak, and that they were witches. And not only that, that they came from a long line of witches, generations, which is also interesting because if you talk to anyone that practices what they call witchcraft, voodoo, palo, a lot of these individuals were initiated, right, by others, that priests that knew and practiced this because they were a part of a long bloodline that understood it, or the person themselves came from a family, a long line of people that practiced these things, and therefore it was generationally passed down naturally or taught to them because it was in their family. So this show shows that these things that we consider witchcraft, magic, sorcery, palo, voodoo, whatever name you want to call it, is something that is generational for the most part, or something that people learn from others when they're initiated and they confront other people that have been part of a bloodline and they have years and generations of doing this. So this show covered that, and that's something that is real. So even though it's in a TV show, that is something that actually exists. So that right there I thought was very important. What made me actually wake up and really pay attention to this show was when they actually found out that they had these powers because they discovered these powers through a Ouija board. And I won't go into the history of that. But as they discovered that, Ouija board told them to go up to the attic. And when they went to the attic, there was this book called the Book of Shadows, which is also in the movie Practical Magic, which is also, I believe, something that's crucial in Wicca. But anyway, this book had a bunch of spells and different guides and practices for the witches that came upon this book from their generation. So this was a book that was hand down, right? It was added to by different individuals to whatever time frame they lived. And now these three sisters come across this book that's been in their family for ages, right? So it was like a handed down guide for witches in that family on how to protect themselves and survive and practice their craft. So I thought that was also telling. So as they're flipping through this, the younger sister's the one that discovered it. When they all get together, they ask the younger sister, well, what is it that you've seen in the book? And the first thing she said was the foundation of magic is timing, feeling, and the phases of the moon. So that kind of made me stop in my tracks, because everything, almost everything you see is predicated on phases of the moon or the universal cycles. When you see movies released, obviously women's menstrual cycles, a lot of things that go on according to the cycle. And if you do something that's not in alignment with these cycles and your cycle, if they're not aligned, then it 10 to 1 isn't going to be favorable for you. So when I seen that, it made me think like, okay, that's deep. I have to look at that. And it also made me realize that that's also the definition of failure, is that you could do the right thing at the wrong time, and that's still failure, right? So that's the definition of failure. So that's what stood out in the show. So as they discover this, right, and it's also in real life that a lot of people that practice magic, they'll tell you once they're taught and initiated that basically it's about your imagination and how you feel, right, and the timing in which you do things. And if you do certain things, let's say in a full moon or a new moon, they have different results, and it won't work unless you do it according to that time frame. So that touched on something that is real, is actual, and that's something that I've experienced, and I've actually interviewed people and been through that experience. So that's a real thing in this TV show. Something else that stood out with this show that I thought was very interesting was that when I found out about the making of the show, this was the first time, it might still be at the time, it was the only show that had like a full-time bonded demonologist work on the show, write for the show, create the show, things of that nature. It's never happened before in Hollywood where you had an actual demonologist that was instrumental in the making of this show. So you think about that. So this show had someone that studied demons, that was into this, and actually was in the creative process of making this show happen. So even though this is TV, and even though this is fantasy, right, this was based on accounts of someone that actually is involved in this. So there's a lot of accuracy in this show, a lot of things that are not far-fetched, a lot of things that actually are rooted in truth. And I think that's what also made this show successful, was that it can actually be a go-to type of show for anybody that's practicing this. So this wasn't something that was just made up from imagination. This was also something that was made up from someone that was into this very heavily. That's very telling. So as you watch the show and you see the episodes and the plot lines, you'll see that these plot lines actually are rooted in things of truth. So basically this episode was based on the fact that because they're witches, they are now conscious of it. And when they weren't conscious of it, they were ignorant, they didn't know that they had these abilities. There was a scene in which it said that because we didn't know, they was reading from the book, witches that don't know, or if you don't know you have these powers, you're kind of protected. out of your ignorance, which means that evil spirits and negativity won't approach you as much because you don't have this knowledge. But once you're aware of your powers, right, and once you know who you are and that you have these abilities, now the evil spirits step up their level of attack towards you, and now you are liable for protecting yourself. That is something that stood out as well, because if you watch things like Spider-Man, or even in real life in Spider-Man, right, great power comes great responsibility. So even in real life, when you learn more, right, and you increase your knowledge and you increase your wisdom, your trials start to get more sophisticated. You start to encounter more difficulty, more hardship. Negative spirits start to come after you, because now you're aware, you're conscious, and you're stronger now. So for you to grow, more, I don't want to say dangerous, but the level of attack and the level of negativity that comes your way is increased, because A, you can now handle it because you have knowledge, and then B, you have to have something that's stronger, that's opposite of what you're learning in order for you to become a better person. So they also realized this. So this first episode was very heavy, and it said a lot. But the premise of the episode was just that. Because they knew now, they had what's called warlocks, what they call negative witches or negative magicians that would come steal their power, right? So that's what this first episode was about. So just like in real life, when you try to do good and you try to better yourself, you will have people that are jealous, envious. You will have people that don't like your success, so they will come after you more. So as you rise, that's just part of the trials and tribulations. So in this first episode, those type of people were represented as a warlock. Those people whose sole primary goal was to take these three sisters' power. And it was also telling because it also showed how numbers and numerology is important, right? Because there was three of them, they had what's called the power of three. So in numerology, right, if you look at three also is a portal for man and the spirit to become one and to actually conjoin on this physical plane and to become spiritual. That's what the Trinity represents. So if you look at things that come in threes, three symbolize a union between the spirit, right, and the human, and what comes out of that, right? Father, Son, Holy Ghost. So anytime you're dealing with threes, you're dealing with a merger of the physical and the spiritual and the product of that, or the seen and the unseen and the product of that, right? Isis, Osiris, Horus, that's the Trinity, right? Mary, Jesus, Father, that's the Trinity. That's the merger of the seen and the unseen to create a whole new entity of spiritual beings on this planet. That's what the number three represents, a merger of the unseen and seen and the product of that. So being that it was three of them, their powers was unstoppable if they all conjoined with each other and stayed together. So the warlock understood this. So in order for them to be defeated, he had to isolate them. So numerology is also important when it comes to things like witchcraft, magic, and sorcery. So you have astrology, right, which is the cycles of the universe, and you have numerology, right? And you have group. It also shows the power of a group. When you group up with people towards an endeavor, whether it's a business or success or even in magic, it actually improves your chances of becoming successful. It actually makes you stronger. So this show covered a lot of themes. I mean, on top of numerology, on top of astrology, the power of group focus, spiritual union with the physical. This show is very heavily rooted into occult themes, and it shows that, and it's very real. And the fact that this came out in the 90s, it also showed that since the 90s, right, this country has heavily increased in its practice and its promotion of things like magic, sorcery, and witchcraft, to the point to where now it's not really strange. People find themselves wearing more crystals, more gemstones. Things have become so mainstream that the 90s actually changed how we approach religion. Some people are like, well, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. A lot of this is contributed to the climate of the 90s and Wicca. So that's what this first episode was about. So I wanted to do this video to kind of cover that and to show that the 90s was a turning point, and this TV show represented that. So this first episode was basically covering these themes, and it kind of set the blueprint for the rest of the season. So this was a brief breakdown of the first episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I have other episodes coming, and I'm going to do other TV shows as well. So please give me your feedback. You know, if you have experiences with astrology, numerology, or anything of this nature, witchcraft, please feel free to chime in or charm in and let me know what your experiences are, because these themes are very real, and there actually could be teaching tools if you know what to look for in these different episodes and the symbolisms. You can actually use it in your life and take the truth out of fantasy and make it something that's practical. And you'll see that because this show wasn't just a matter of it being sci-fi and purely imagination, the fact that they had someone that's work is to study these things shows that this is something that can be used on a regular basis without being spooked out to actually change and impact your life. So with that, thank you for joining me. I'm a Marvelous. This is Hollywood Decoded. Peace.